In a tense courtroom, where every whisper seems to echo with the weight of justice, Marcus Johnson, a black man in his 30s, stands before the dock. The chains around his wrists and ankles clink softly with each movement, a reminder to all of the gravity of the situation. The atmosphere is heavy, charged with palpable tension. On the other side of the room, families and members of the black community watch anxiously, knowing that Marcus's fate goes far beyond his individual case. Marcus is accused of a heinous crime, the murder of an influential white woman. Yet, from the outset, the evidence against him is thin, fragmented, almost non-existent. No credible witness has seen him at the crime scene, and the physical evidence is scant. A partial fingerprint, an object found near the body, but no irrefutable proof linking him directly to the scene. His lawyer, Sarah Leroy, a brilliant and combative young woman, has methodically dismantled the prosecution's arguments, highlighting the obvious flaws in the investigation. But throughout the trial, another battle is taking place. Judge Williams, an aging white man with a constantly stern expression, exhibits barely concealed disdain toward Marcus and his defense team. This is not the first time Williams has presided over a trial involving a black defendant. His name is whispered with fear in the corridors of justice, a severe, unrelenting judge with a reputation for imposing maximum sentences on minorities. Some view him as a pillar of justice, others as a man whose decisions are tainted by racism, fueled by an old and dangerous ideology. From the very first day of the trial, Williams has made his opinion clear. He is condescending, interrupting Sarah when she attempts to argue, dismissing valid objections with careless gestures, and allowing the prosecution to present dubious evidence. Marcus, though aware of his innocence, feels the noose tightening around him. Every decision seems orchestrated to convict him. The prosecutor, an ambitious and cunning man, has no solid case, but he knows that in this court, under the watchful eye of Judge Williams, logic and reason can give way to fear and prejudice. He presents witnesses of questionable morality, shifting and sometimes contradictory testimonies, but it doesn't matter. In Judge Williams's eyes, Marcus is already guilty, not for what he has done, but for what he is. Despite the doubts raised by the defense, Williams makes it clear that he is determined to turn this trial into an example. The black community, loudly present in the gallery, is there to support Marcus, but they too are the subject of hostile glares. At every interruption, every murmur, the judge reminds them of order with disproportionate severity. The fear grows. What if this trial, like so many before it, is nothing but a charade? A spectacle orchestrated to perpetuate an unjust legal system, where skin color is a sentence in itself. As the days of the trial unfold, it becomes evident that Williams is trying to steer the jury toward an inevitable conclusion. He uses his discretionary power to minimize the prosecution's mistakes while belittling the defense's efforts. Marcus, who has always maintained his innocence, watches the jury members with resignation, understanding that they too are under the influence of the judge's prejudices. His hands tremble slightly on the witness stand, but he keeps his head high. Every contemptuous look from the judge, every disparaging remark, is a blow not only to him but to all those fighting for fair treatment. Then comes the fateful day of the verdict. The courtroom is packed. Tense, anxious faces are fixed on Judge Williams, a man who at that moment seems to embody an implacable figure of the law. The whispering of the spectators is almost imperceptible, but the waiting is unbearable. Marcus Johnson, sitting at the defense table, remains upright, though his hands are clenched into a tight fist under the table. Beside him, Sarah Leroy, his lawyer, stares at the judge with an intensity that barely conceals her anger. She knows, just as Marcus does, that the outcome of this trial was decided long before the facts were examined. Judge Williams finally stands, in a solemn and calculated movement. His black robe floats slightly behind him as he adjusts his glasses before casting a cold glance at the assembly. The silence in the room becomes almost oppressive. Williams knows he holds in his hands the fate of a man, but it doesn't seem to weigh heavily on his mind. He looks at the file before him, but his eyes scan it with detachment. To him, Marcus is just another defendant, a mere formality in the judicial process. He has presided over so many similar trials, with the same predictable pattern. A black man accused of a heinous crime, flimsy evidence, but enough to serve as prejudices, and a verdict that reinforces the social order he has long defended. When he speaks, his words are cold, devoid of emotion. He doesn't mention justice or redemption. He makes no reference to the doubts raised throughout the trial, the gaping holes in the evidence, or even the contradictory testimonies. His voice echoes through the room, impassive and mechanical, as if reciting a memorized script. The words that leave his mouth are heavy with consequence, but to him, they are nothing more than routine, a simple exercise in asserting his authority. The court, having reviewed the evidence in this case, finds the defendant, Marcus Johnson, guilty of the premeditated murder of Mrs. Ellen Whitaker. Therefore, in accordance with the laws of the state, I hereby pronounce the sentence of death. There is no dramatic pause, no emphasis. It is said with the coldness of a man signing an administrative document, as if it were an insignificant decision. Marcus's life, the pain of his family, the tireless fight of the defense, none of that seems to matter in the eyes of the judge. Williams refuses even to meet Marcus's gaze, as though looking into the eyes of the man he has just condemned would make the sentence too human, too real. His fingers tap lightly on the bench, betraying his impatience to finish this case, to move on to another conviction. The breath catches, a murmur of shock runs through the room. On the defense side, Sarah Leroy seems frozen for a moment. The judge's indifference strikes her like a slap, the confirmation of a broken system, blind to justice. But beside her, Marcus, though visibly crushed, does not lower his head. He looks straight ahead, his eyes filled with fierce dignity. In this moment, his calm is almost supernatural. He is not surprised by the verdict because he knows his fate was sealed the moment he stepped into that courtroom. To Judge Williams, he was never an innocent man until proven guilty. He was a black man presumed guilty from the start. Silent tears run down the faces of his family, seated in the front row. His mother, clutching a crumpled handkerchief in her trembling hands, struggles to suppress a sob. His brother, helpless, bites his lips to stifle his anger. The audience, divided between those who hoped for a miracle and those who expected this outcome, watches in a mix of stunned disbelief and resignation. Many members of the black community in the room exchange glances with solemn faces, knowing that this trial is just another example of institutionalized racism that poisons the judicial system. Judge Williams remains unflappable. He adjusts his glasses once more, signs a document with exaggerated slowness, then stands without uttering another word. He turns away from the courtroom as if closing a trivial case, indifferent to the indignation-filled stares that follow him. For him, it's just another case among many. He leaves his seat with chilling coldness, distancing himself from Marcus's fate as one might dismiss a crumpled piece of paper tossed in the trash. To him, this black man, Marcus Johnson, is already just another number on the list of those condemned to death. His skin, his poverty, and the deeply ingrained prejudices in the judge's mind had already sentenced him long before the trial even began. The injustice is glaring, but in Judge Williams's eyes, it is justified. He believes he has done his duty. However, what Judge Williams doesn't know is that the case is far from over. In his mind, Marcus Johnson's conviction is an inevitable conclusion, a mere formality in a system he has controlled for decades. But what he doesn't realize is that Sarah Leroy, Marcus's tenacious lawyer, has planned a counterattack that will change the course of history. For her, the death sentence is an intolerable injustice, and she never intended to accept this biased verdict. From the start of the trial, Sarah had sensed something was wrong. She had noticed the judge's coldness, his barely concealed contempt for her client, and most of all, his almost obsessive desire to convict Marcus, despite the lack of solid evidence. But rather than be discouraged, she worked in silence, gathering information alongside the trial. The day before the verdict, she received a revelation that could change everything. What she discovered could not only exonerate Marcus, but also destroy Judge Williams's career and reputation. In the shadows, she had gathered evidence he never could have imagined. It turns out that Judge Williams had close ties with one of the key figures in the prosecution, a main witness whose testimony had played a crucial role in Marcus's indictment. Sarah, aided by a team of private detectives and investigative journalists, uncovered a secret relationship between Williams and this witness, stretching back several years. Worse still, damning evidence shows that the judge had directly influenced some aspects of the investigation, steering the conclusions of the investigators to make Marcus an ideal suspect. These revelations were explosive, but Sarah knew she had to use them strategically. Rather than reveal them immediately, she prepared a dramatic move. A few days after the verdict, during an unexpected press conference, she officially announced she would appeal the decision. In front of a crowd of journalists, she partially revealed her findings, enough to shock the public and raise serious doubts about Judge Williams's integrity. The news hit like a bombshell. In the days that followed, the case took an unexpected turn. The media, eager for scandal, began to dig into Williams's past. They discovered that this was not the first time his decisions had been tainted by accusations of bias, particularly in cases involving Black defendants. Stories emerged, revealing a pattern of unjust decisions, always skewed against minorities and always in favor of a privileged elite. Sarah Leroy, however, was not content to simply fuel the media pressure. She worked tirelessly with her legal team to prepare a motion for a trial review. Armed with the new evidence, she was certain she could not only prove Marcus's innocence, but also bring down Williams from his pedestal. She knew she was about to change her client's life, but also shake the corrupt system that had condemned him. The community, galvanized by these revelations, began to mobilize in large numbers. Protests were organized outside the courthouse. Public figures, activists, and influential personalities spoke out, denouncing not only the injustice suffered by Marcus, but also the systemic racism embodied by figures like Judge Williams. Tension mounted. Calls for judicial reform multiplied, and Marcus Johnson's name became a symbol of the fight against systemic abuse. Meanwhile, Williams began to feel the ground shift beneath his feet. The cold confidence he once displayed began to crack. Internal pressures within the judiciary started to weigh on him. Influential judges, once his allies, began to distance themselves, worried about being tainted by the growing scandal. His colleagues recommended he step down temporarily, but Williams, consumed by pride and blinded by his sense of invincibility, refused. He was convinced that Sarah Leroy was just an ambitious young lawyer who would eventually crumble under the pressure. But Sarah was more determined than ever. She filed an official complaint against Judge Williams for corruption and abuse of power. The appellate court agreed to examine the new evidence and ordered a thorough investigation. The once untouchable judge was now in the hot seat. Days passed, and each new revelation further eroded his credibility. The long-awaited day of the new hearing arrived, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Every seat was occupied, and those who couldn't enter pressed against the doors, eager to know the outcome of this case that had captivated public attention. The journalists' cameras captured every movement, every whisper, as if the story was unfolding not just in the courtroom but in front of the eyes of the entire world. This time, the focus was not on Marcus Johnson, but on Judge Williams, the man once all-powerful, now summoned to explain himself in the face of the grave accusations against him. Sitting in the defendant's seat, his face was more rigid than ever. The arrogance that had always characterized him seemed to have turned into cold determination, but a flicker of worry lingered in his eyes. This was a scene no one could have imagined just weeks earlier, when Williams ruled the court with absolute authority, convinced that his power was untouchable. Sarah Leroy, Marcus's lawyer, entered with the same determination that had brought her this far. She was calm, methodical, but her gaze was fixed on the goal she had set from the start, to dismantle the edifice of corruption and prejudice embodied by Williams. When he was called to speak, the judge attempted to downplay the facts, claiming his actions were merely procedural and that he never intended to distort the course of justice. His words were cold, devoid of any compassion, and he carefully avoided meeting the eyes of those who watched him with icy attention. But this time, the roles were reversed. Williams, who once dominated the courtroom with condescension, now found himself cornered by the damning evidence Sarah had painstakingly gathered. With surgical precision, she dismantled his defense, one argument at a time, exposing the compromising ties between Williams and the key witness who had sealed Marcus's conviction. The evidence of collusion was irrefutable: email exchanges, intercepted conversations, and even suspicious financial transactions between Williams and influential members of the community who wanted to see Marcus fall. Each new strike delivered by Sarah causes Judge Williams to lose a little more of his composure. His facade of control gradually cracks, revealing signs of agitation and frustration. The audience, the activists present in the room, the journalists, everyone holds their breath with each revelation. Marcus, sitting not far away, watches in silence, his hands slightly trembling. For the first time in months, he can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Today, he is no longer the defenseless accused. He is a man watching justice restore itself. The climax comes when Sarah reveals a key piece of evidence, a secret recording of a conversation between Williams and the prosecutor in the case, in which the judge implicitly admits that he never believed Marcus was guilty, but did what had to be done to protect certain political and financial interests. The recording lands like a bombshell in the room. A heavy silence fills the space before murmurs of indignation ripple through the crowd like a wave. Faced with this damning revelation, Williams finally loses his cool. He tries to justify himself, stammering incoherent excuses, but it's too late. His career is in ruins, and he knows it. The sentence he thought he had delivered with authority now turns against him with devastating force. Finally, after hours of hearings and debates, the court delivers a historic verdict. Marcus Johnson's conviction is overturned. He is officially exonerated of all charges. The relief that sweeps through the room is palpable. Marcus slowly rises, almost in disbelief, before being enveloped by the embraces of his family and loved ones. His mother, who had never lost hope, cries with joy while holding her son tightly in her arms. The tears, mixed with nervous laughter, speak volumes about the depth of this victory. For Sarah Leroy, this victory is bittersweet. She knows she has won a crucial battle, but also that the fight for justice is far from over. Yet, seeing Marcus surrounded by those he loves, free after so many months of suffering, she knows it was all worth it. Her efforts, her determination, her faith in the truth have triumphed over the system. As for Williams, he leaves the courtroom under the scornful and accusatory gazes of the crowd. His reign of judicial terror is over, and a disciplinary investigation is already underway to examine his many abuses of power. The foundations of his once solid power crumble under the weight of the revelations. He is now nothing but a shadow of his former self, a fallen man, confronted by his own demons. As Marcus Johnson exits the courtroom, free and cheered on by an ecstatic crowd, a wave of emotion overwhelms him. For a moment, he stands still, gazing up at the blue sky, savoring the fresh air as if breathing for the first time in years. Around him, shouts of joy and applause erupt, fists raised in solidarity. Strangers hug him, shake his hand, pat his back. But despite all this love, Marcus is deeply moved, almost overwhelmed by the gravity of the moment. He turns to Sarah Leroy, who watches him from a few steps away, a tired but triumphant smile on her lips. They gaze at each other for a long moment in silence, a silent yet powerful exchange. Marcus knows that he owes her far more than his freedom. Sarah has given him back his dignity, his hope, his faith in justice. Without her, he would have been just another victim of the system, a man erased from history, broken under the weight of a rigged trial. "Thank you," he murmurs finally, his voice full of emotion. "I can never thank you enough." Sarah nods slightly, humble in her victory. "It wasn't just a case for me, Marcus. It was a battle we had to win. For you, for all those who have been wrongfully accused." At that moment, journalists approach, their cameras and microphones pointed toward them. Questions come from all directions, but Marcus raises a hand, calmly imposing silence. Everyone falls quiet, eager to hear what he will say. Today, I am free. Not because the system did its job, but because people like Sarah Leroy had the courage to fight for me. The courage to expose a corrupt system, to stand up to those who abuse their power. But this battle is not over. There are still thousands of Marcus Johnsons in prisons, thousands of people condemned simply because of the color of their skin, because of their origins. It is for them that I will fight now. This is not just my victory. It's theirs. A thunderous round of applause erupts. Cameras continue to film as Marcus steps forward, this time as a free man, bearing a cause greater than himself. As for Judge Williams, his name is erased from the books of judicial history, replaced by that of Marcus Johnson, a symbol of victory against injustice.